Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another Instant Deck Tech. So today is Thursday, which means it's Tier 1 Thursday, and we are heading to Modern this week to check out a deck that has slowly been creeping its way towards the top of the format, and it is its own special kind of torture, and we're talking, of course, about Lantern Control. So the build we're looking at today recently took Lunik to a 5-0 finish in a competitive league on Magic Online, but this deck has a ton of finishes. It's pretty popular at the moment. A quick reminder before we break it all down, if you enjoy this deck and you want to see it made into videos, take a minute, click the like button, the subscribe button, leave a comment, anything you can do to support your deck, because whichever deck is most popular gets a shot at being made into videos next week. So Lantern Control is built around a card that no one ever thought would be a Tier 1 staple in Modern, Lantern of Insight, a 1-mana artifact that makes each player play with the top card of their library revealed, and then you can tap it and sack it to make target player shuffle their library. So while you occasionally will force an opponent to shuffle with Lantern of Insight, especially if you have multiple lanterns, the main idea of this deck is using Lantern of Insight to look at the top card of both your library and your opponent's library, and then you use some other artifacts to control your opponent's draws. So we have a bunch more 1-mana artifacts that essentially allow you to mill one or exile one from the top of a library. Codex Shredder mills target player 1 card. Ghoul Caller Bell mills each player 1 card. Pyxis of Pandemonium exiles the top card of a player's library. So what you want to do is, after you get your Lantern down and can see what your opponent has, you basically use this group of cards to control your opponent's draws and basically make them draw as poorly as possible. Make sure they don't find the answers to the stuff that you have on the battlefield. Maybe if they don't have lands, you can kind of mana screw them. If they have plenty of lands, you can try to make sure they just draw a land each turn and never find any cards to actually beat you with. So that is the plan of this deck, is use your information advantage from Lantern of Insight to just mess with your opponent's draws and make it so they never draw anything good. Ensnaring Bridge is a key piece of this plan, and this is where the answer part comes in. So Ensnaring Bridge, this deck is super cheap, so it's really easy to just dump your hand on the battlefield in the early game, and then Bridge makes it so you're not going to die to creatures. So then, as you're manipulating your opponent's library, you make sure they don't draw Abrupt Decays and other answers to your Ensnaring Bridge, and then you can kind of let them draw creatures. Sure, you can draw your Tarmogoyf, it can't attack anyway, but I'm going to make sure you don't draw your Lightning Bolt so you can kill me with direct damage. The deck also plays a bunch of discard to deal with things proactively from the opponent's hand. Also gives you more information advantage since you know what's going on in your opponent's hand. If your opponent has an Abrupt Decay in hand, maybe you don't just slam your Ensnaring Bridge and try to play around that in some way or another. So Inquisition and Thoughtseize let you tear apart your opponent's hand. Collective Brutality lets you deal with a creature in the early game, gain a bit of life and drain your opponent, and work like a duress. Plus, you can discard a bunch of extra cards in your hand to make sure you're empty-handed and power up your Ensnaring Bridge. Then the deck plays some really weird answers that you don't typically see. So Abrupt Decay, that's normal. That just kills something. Anything converted mana cost 3 or less. But the deck plays Surgical Extraction as a permanent answer to problematic things. So, for example, a hard matchup for this deck would be Valakut. So your opponent doesn't even really need to cast spells. They just draw lands, or they draw spells that get them into lands. Eventually, they're going to get Valakut. Sure, you can keep them off Scapeshift and Titan. Sooner or later, they're probably going to just Valakut you to death naturally. Well, if you can mill a Valakut with one of your 1-drop artifacts, then you just Surgical Extraction it, problem solved forever. Pithing Needle deals with things that might slip through, like Planeswalkers, that would be hard for the deck to deal with otherwise, because one of the ways that this deck can get beat is your opponent strings together draws. So you mill something you don't want them to draw, something else is good on the top of their library. You mill that, a third good card is on the top of their library. If that's a Chandra Torch of Defiance or Liliana the Veil, that would be really problematic, but you can always control your draws as well to find your Pithing Needle and then just shut down that threat. As far as the rest of the deck, it's mostly ways to find your artifacts, especially your Lantern of Insight and also your Ensnaring Bridge. Ancient Stirring, 1 mana, tutors or searches an artifact, essentially, or land from your top 5 cards. Glintnest Crane, top 4 cards, finds an artifact. Infernal Tutor lets you find anything in the late game once you're empty-handed. And Inventor's Fair is a land that gains you a bit of life, which is nice because you're always going to have 3 artifacts in this deck if things are going reasonably well. And then you can tutor up an Ensnaring Bridge or another Lantern or something with it in the late game. As far as the mana, 4 Mox Opals, Glimmer Voids, and Ether Hubs allows you to play spells of any color, so you have essentially 9 things that produce mana of any color. Academy Ruins gets back your Lanterns and Snaring Bridges if your opponent does find a way to kill them. And then a bunch of fast lands and a single forest. As far as the sideboard, a lot of focus on the graveyard, so because this deck is naturally milling the opponent, you want to make sure that you have ways to deal with that. If your opponent's on Dredge, you're kind of helping them out in some sense by milling their prized amalgams and their blood gas and all that stuff. Torment's Crypt, Grafdigger's Cage, and more surgical extraction shuts that down. Welding Jar and Spellskite protects your pieces. Welding Jar, you just sack it, regenerate your Ensnaring Bridge or a Lantern of Insight. Spellskite, you change the target of, say, an Abrupt Decay or an Ancient Grudge from your Ensnaring Bridge or your Lantern of Insight to the Spellskite, and that kind of takes the fall for your other artifact. Nature's Claim deals with opponents' artifacts, and Abrupt Decay, more removal. And then just a few random things. One more Collective Brutality, a Crucible of Worlds, to keep getting lands back from the graveyard. Kind of helpful if your opponent has a lot of disruption. You can get back your Academy Ruins, which in turn can get back your artifacts. Makes it really hard for your opponent to permanently deal with your stuff. And then Leyline of Sanctities shuts down burn spells, shuts down discard, anything that would target you. And that is Lantern Control for Modern. And that's been our Instant Deck Tech for today. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon.